Chapter 3. The early morning mist was beginning to thin as Jar Jar Binks waded through the Naboo swamp in search of breakfast. Like most Gungans, he preferred to catch his food fresh. The damp air felt good against the reddish ear flaps that hung halfway down his back, and the murky water was pleasantly warm around his thick toes. All he needed now was... A gleam of white caught his eye, half hidden in the swamp ooze. "Ooh, pretty morning munching," Jar Jar thought happily. One weary arm reached down and retrieved the clam. The shell snapped closed as Jar Jar's hand touched it. Jar Jar settled down to open his meal. When the shell opened at last, Jar Jar scooped the clam out of the shell with his long tongue, enjoying its delicate flavor and smoothness. "'Tisn't the life," he thought. "Goody munching and old Captain Topballs making fuss about little accidents." He looked up and froze. A giant thing moved through the swamp. A thing like an enormous head without eyes. It was as big as the nightmarish monsters that rose out of the core rifts from time to time. Swamp creatures fled before it. Among the Nuna and Peko Peko ran a tall, bearded human, scarcely slowed by the water and Brudiger tree roots. Even he could not stay ahead of it, though. The thing gained on him steadily, but Jar Jar could see that the monster was not chasing any of the creatures, not even the human. It was headed straight for him, Jar Jar Binks. "No!" Jar Jar cried. Unfreezing, he dropped the clamshell and grabbed the human running past him. "Help me! Help me!" "Let go!" the human shouted, but Jar Jar clung tightly. The human dragged him through the swamp, while the monster gained rapidly. Just before it reached them, the human flung them both down in the mud. Jar Jar felt a hot wind against his back, and the thing had passed by. As he pulled himself out of the mud, he saw the huge creature vanish into the mist. "Oi!" he said in an ecstasy of relief. He hugged the human who had saved him. "I love yous." The human left, wringing the swamp water out of his clothes to glare at Jar Jar. "Are you brainless?" he demanded. "You almost got us killed." "I speak," Jar Jar said, taken aback. This human had no right to be insulting, just because he had saved Jar Jar's life. And now the creature was gone, and Jar Jar was no longer so frightened. He could taste traces of fuel in the swamp air. The thing that had chased them had only been some sort of machine, and not a monster from the core after all. "The ability to speak does not make you intelligent," the human told him. "Now get out of here." Jar Jar stared as the human started off. "No, no," he said, following. "Misa, stay!" What was that you human said? Oh, yes. "Misa, your humble servant." "That won't be necessary," the human said, absently scanning the mist. Jar Jar rolled his eyes. Humans never understand anything. He told the man it was demanded by the gods as a life debt. The human did not answer, but didn't move off again, either. Encouraged, Jar Jar said, "Misa called Jar Jar Binks." "I have no time for this now," the tall man muttered. "Say what?" Jar Jar turned to see what he was looking at. Two strange flying machines broke out of the mist. Each carried a creature like a Gungan skeleton, tall and bone-white. They were chasing another human. This one was younger and had no beard. He wore the same sort of brown and tan robes as the man who had rescued Jar Jar. "Oh, no!" Jar Jar cried, his voice climbing higher and higher. Something knocked him face down in the mud, and he heard a bearded man say, "Stay down." Jar Jar raised his head, spitting mud out of the water. "Die!" he finished, just as the flying machines fired two brilliant bolts of light. To Jar Jar's astonishment, a bar of green light appeared in the bearded man's hand and bounced the shots back at the skeleton creatures. The skeleton and their machines blew up. Sparks and hot metal fell hissing into the swamp. Quiet returned, except for the panting of the human the machines had been chasing. "Sorry, master," the newcomer said after a moment. "The water fried my weapon." He pulled a short, blackened tube from his belt and handed it to Jar Jar's rescuer. The bearded man examined the tube, then gave the newcomer a severe look. "You forgot to turn your power off again, didn't you?" The newcomer nodded sheepishly. Jar Jar cocked his head in sympathy and as he picked himself up out of the mud. He understood how easy it was to forget things. He'd done it himself. Far too often. "It won't take long to recharge," the bearded man said, handing the tube back to the newcomer. "But I hope you'll finally learn this lesson, my young Padawan." "Yes, master," the other man said in a subdued tone. No more lecturings, Jar Jar thought. "You saved me again! Hey!" he said, hoping to change the subject. "What's this?" the newcomer said enthusiastically. "Local," the bearded man replied. Let's go, before more of these droids show up. The offhand dismissal annoyed Jar Jar briefly. Then the rest of the man's words sank in. More? More did you speak? He did not want to see any more machines. The two men began to run without replying. Jar Jar followed, thinking rapidly. None of his usual hiding places would be safe from the machines, but the machines had hovered over the swamp, and they did not look as if they would work well underwater. And underwater was... Excuse me, but the Moto Grande safest place would be Ortaganga, he said as they ran. 'Tis where I grew up. 'Tis a safe city. The men stopped running and looked at him. A city? The bearded man said. Can you take us there? Jar Jar hesitated. Otagunga would be safe for the humans, but for him... Well, on second thought, no, not really. Seeing their surprise, he looked down. It's embarrassing. But I'm afraid I've been banished. My forgotten dear bosses would have been terrible things to me if me gone back there. In the distance, strange noises echoed through the swamp. You hear that? The bearded man said. That's the sound of 1,000 terrible things heading this way. And when they find us, they will crush us, grind us up into little pieces, then blast us into the oblivion, the second man added with unnecessary infamous. Your point is well seen, Jar Jar said, with as much dignity as he could manage. This way! Hurry! The odd, fraud-like native led Qui-Gon and his apprentice to the shore of a lake. After warning them not to expect a warm welcome, he leaped high in the air and dove into the water. The two Jedi pulled off breath masks from their belt pockets and waded in after him. Sunlight barely penetrated the murky lake water, less than a meter below the surface. The light began to dim. Soon it was hard to see. As Jar Jar led the two Jedi deeper and deeper, Qui-Gon began to fear that they would lose him in the increasing darkness. Suddenly, Qui-Gon saw a gleam of light ahead. In another moment, he could make out a string of amber bubbles, shining warm and bright through the dark water. Their rich yellow glow lit the water for meters around. The bubbles varied in size, and the largest looked to be nearly 75 meters tall. A lacework of metal and colors of old bronze topped each globe, helping the walls keep their shape and providing a place to link the bubbles together. As they drew near, Qui-Gon could make out buildings inside these bubbles. Gungans walked casually along the streets, while fish swam past a few meters away outside the bubble wall. They had almost reached the bubble city, and Qui-Gon began to look for a door or an airlock. But Jar Jar swam straight towards the side of the bubble, and passed right through it into the city inside. The bubble wall sealed seamlessly behind him. Permeable hydrostatic membranes, Qui-Gon thought. They could keep the seawater out, but let people go through. So the city doesn't need an airlock. Impressive. He followed Jar Jar, beginning to hope they would reach the Naboo Palace in time after all. But the bosses of Otagunga were not willing to help. We said no like the Naboo, he heard the Gungan boss Nass declared when the Jedi were brought before him. Und they no like unses. Na Naboo think they so smarty. They think they brains so big. Obi-Wan tried to argue, but the boss did not want to listen. We said no caring about the Naboo, Boss Ness said flatly. Talk was getting them nowhere, and if they didn't reach the capital city soon, the Trade Federation droids will have taken over. Qui-Gon gestured, reaching out to touch the Gungan's mind. Then speed us on our way, he said. We gonna speed you away, the Gungan boss said, responding readily to Qui-Gon's suggestion. We give you una bongo. The speediest way to the Naboo is going to the core. Now go. Qui-Gon thanked him and turned away. As they walked towards the exit, Obi-Wan whispered, Master, what's a bongo? A transport, I hope, Qui-Gon murmured. Preferably a fast one. He stopped. Jar Jar Binks stood between the two guards, wearing handcuffs and plainly waiting for judgment. Catching Qui-Gon's eye, Jar Jar said, any help here would be had. Obi-Wan frowned. We're short of time, Master, he objected. We'll need a navigator, Qui-Gon said. This Gungan may be of help. Besides, Besides, we talked Jar Jar into coming here. If it weren't for us, he wouldn't be in trouble. Qui-Gon turned back to the Gungan bosses. What does become of Jar Jar Binks here?
He's to be punished,
Boss Nass said.
pounded unto death.
Jar Jar moaned. Obi-Wan looked startled, then worried. Plainly, he had not realized how serious Jar Jar's problem was. Qui-Gon studied the head Gungan. I have saved Jar Jar Binks' life, he told the boss. He owes me what you call a life debt, he gestured, nudging to the Gungan's mind once more. Your gods demanded that his life belongs to me now.
He's lived his yours,
Outlander, Boss Nass said.
Be gone with him.
Jar Jar looked from one side to the other and shook his head.
Count me out of this. Better dead in here than in the court. Ye goods. What's a Misa saying?
As the guards removed Jar Jar's handcuff, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan exchanged looks. Traveling through the core doesn't sound much safer than facing the Trade Federation's battle droids, Qui-Gon thought. But at least this way we'll have a chance of getting to Naboo's queen before the droids do, if we survive the trip.